to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Mike to discuss the Californian education system. Mike was a superintendent in the Californian schools for 18 years, so he has a lot of experience and knowledge in this area. So, Mike, thanks for joining us. What's your background? Can you just give a bit more detail on your background in the California education system? You say you were a superintendent. What kind of roles have you had? And just give us a general flavor of what you're up to in your career in the schooling system.
I actually have a very broad experience. I was a board member actually prior to becoming professionally in the school system. So I've been a board member. I've been a parent. I've then, became an administrator superintendent. So I kind of see the thing from a bunch of different angles. I've also been superintendent all over the state of California. So I've seen different regions and how the interactions of schools in those regions have worked. So that's been my background. I started out as a teacher, and then I quickly moved into administration because that was just my since I'd already been on a board, I'd already seen a lot of the administrative side of what goes on in schools, and that just was my long-term goal to move from teaching to superintendent.
What did you teach when you were a teacher?
I actually was in a middle school, so you kind of my degree is in political science history, so I was a core history teacher. But in middle school, I also taught language arts and math and stuff to a middle school group of students.
So, how, in your experience, has the schooling system changed over time?
The schools, schools really were very decentralized for a great deal of their history. So a lot of times when libertarians talk about government schools, they really kind of don't get the flavor of how schools work. It essentially, or at least in California, because my experience has been in California. Schools used to be funded locally, property tax. So you would go into the local property tax person and you'd know your revenue based on that. And the issue that came up was that some places had good property tax revenue and some places had bad property tax revenue. And so people began to say, oh, that's unequal and that's a problem. But schools were independent. So if you were a school board member, you were creating a budget with an administrator that worked for your school as superintendent. And it was really your budget. It was, most of the money came from what was generated in your community. That changed. In my opinion, that's the biggest change. The curriculum issues, the things about what was taught, that's been an issue for students and teachers and institutions for a long, long time. How do you get people to learn? What is it that you're supposed to teach them? Those things. I remember reading Adam Smith's book where he had a whole section where he was talking about the problem of colleges at that time and how they weren't teaching and professors weren't teaching. But that's a separate issue. The real big change in California schools happened in the mid-'70s when the funding model for the schools changed from a local model to a state allocation model. Huge change that most people just kind of gloss over and say that wasn't really important. It really was, because prior to that, the decisions were really local. You could, it just was a whole different game from that point. My father was a school board member in that system prior to the change.
What kind of role did he have prior to that change? How much sort of control did the local board have relative to what it would have now?
Um, I remember like in terms of, I think I wrote to you that you had the funding change, and then right after that, you had the change in how negotiations with employee groups went. The RADA Act was in 1976, really at the same time that Proposition 13 occurred. And I remember prior to that, you as a board basically consulted with your teacher group. There was no mandatory requirements that you negotiate, and there were very few rules that you had to follow because of negotiations, like giving unions authority over different things. That all changed with that. I remember my dad during the consultations with the union, with the association, the local school association, him working on salary schedules and all that kind of stuff that were eventually adopted at the school. But what happened was the unions would bring it in as this is what we want. This is advisory. This is we want this kind of salary schedule. So the boards were much more involved with all of that stuff prior to the RADA Act, which really basically dictates now what schools can do, and it's much more legal, much more regulated, so that boards were heavily involved in developing their own budget and heavily involved in all of the issues regarding, the workers and conditions. That's all changed. And it all changed about the same time. So board members were much more involved. Now, like I said, 85% of your budget, you have no real control over. So much has to be spent for employees. So much has to be spent for this. So your control over the budget is very small now as a board member.
Could you just clarify what Title 13 is, please, for those who may not know?
Proposition 13 was a property tax initiative. At that time, local counties and cities were the ones that established property tax. And I was very young when that occurred. So I was barely in high school. And so all the implications I didn't understand. But property taxes were going up and up and up and up. And there was really very little control. Local people would just, the tax collector would say, this is what your apportionment is. And it was really creating a problem for property owners. At least that's what the propaganda was. And so the initiative limited the amount of increase and limited, you had to have votes and stuff before you could raise taxes. And it was supposed to really control the ability of the government to just raise your taxes and kind of force you into a problem with your property. It passed, I think, big time. So it supposedly restricted the amount of money that the revenue could be collected on property tax. And it did do that. But of course, politicians are smart. So since that time, they've circumvented it with lots of other ways to raise revenue, lots of ways to make it so they could raise revenue without having to have a vote. That's what Prop 13 was. And that's when it shifted. So that meant that it shifted the local funding of schools to the state. Then after that, schools began to get an allocation from the state of what revenue they had to run their school after that. And to me, that was the biggest impact, is that it shifted to an allocation formula. Schools got the money from the state and not directly from their tax rolls.
A similar thing happened in England. It happened slightly differently, but it happened on the curriculum side. In the 1980s, the Tory government were concerned about basically socialism, particularly from the local Labour councils, who kind of like on a county level. and they pretty much, and those local education authorities under there had lots of control over curriculum. There was no sort of standardized. Well, there was you had the O levels and you had the A levels, but beyond that, it wasn't particularly standardized what curriculum you would pick or whatever. And they decided that to rein in socialism and increase standards, inverted commas, they introduced a national curriculum in the late 1980s. And since then, the goal of, when the Tories have been in power in particular, is been a goal of centralising the education system as much as possible. So back, did Gove bring it in about 5-6 years ago? What was called the free school, which wasn't really free. Well, it was free to go at the point of use. But the main thing about it was that it was free from the local education authority, answered directly to central government in London, in Whitehall, as opposed to the local education authority. So the continual sort of centralization is certainly not unique to the US. We've had very similar forces in England as well. Tim.
The point you brought up about California, I think, has to be referenced here. Is like California is 40 million people. I think it has a bigger economy than Germany, and this is one of the Taleb's points in his scaling and size. Is if North Dakota did California's policy, I presume it would go much better than if California did its policy, just by the sheer size of California. And also, I think Swithin's point is hilarious. We've talked about this before, of how the Thatcherites inadvertently created the system which they dislike as well. I'm going to move on a little bit and ask a few questions. Did the Common Core, what's known as Common Core, and to the extent you know, change in the standardized testing things in the Bush years, change anything further regarding this, Mike?
I kind of think all of this stuff was purposely together. You couldn't have, like, the whole Common Core thing had the funding model not changed. You couldn't have the Common Core or the testing. There really had to be central control to make those things even a thing. Because prior to all the effort for the testing, for instance, and the Common Core, schools owned their own test. We did our own contracting with testing companies. There were a lot more testing companies. There were a lot more textbook companies. All of that was much more independent in regard to what you did. So the critical piece is the centralizing. And in California, they did it through revenue, which I think is the most powerful way to do it. Curriculum, like in England, the curriculum centralizing, that's okay. I mean, that's what they wanted. But the really critical one is when you own the money, when you send schools the money, schools really have to line up and do what you say. That's the only way that the Common Core effort could even be accomplished. So it really was not. It wasn't independent. I think all of this has been a constant effort to centralize. In California, they used the purse first, which from that regard was brilliant on their part. I mean, they knew exactly how that was going to go and made it much easier for them to then say, okay, now here's your testing, here's your core, your Common Core. Although I will tell you that when you look at Common Core closely and you look at the old standards that were used, there's not a dramatic change in the actual verbiage of standards. There's been a really sophisticated crosswalk between the old standards and Common Core standards in both English and or language arts and math. There are no Common Core standards for science and history, social studies. It's only math and language arts in California. And when you look at it, they've changed a lot of verbiage, but they haven't changed a lot of stuff. And it only could have happened based on centralization, and I think that was their intent from the very beginning. I think it's all Trojan horse stuff. So in England, the Conservatives or the Tories was a Trojan horse, and so was Prop 13, a Trojan horse that allowed them to centralize all of the control of schools through funding. I think there was a real intent there because all this stuff seemed to happen at the same time and begin to roll really at the same time.
Oh, one of the points that I've made on the show before is about golden ages regarding this. This is one point that Michael Malice made in his debate with Tom Woods on Alexander Hamilton. In some ways, and so one of the huge upsides recently of Common Core, as well as other recent, well, they've actually outright closed the schools the past year in various levels. The compulsory attendance laws were they had a lot more teeth, I think, historically. I can hear stories from my parents and grandparents about truancy officers going out if people were absent. I've never heard that maybe for the poorer communities they still do that, but I highly doubt that. So in the sort of 1900 to 1980s period, so to speak, this is where the homeschooling, in a way, has been allowed, but in some areas there have been some attacks on it, so to speak, as well. So do you think the pre-whatever time period was as good as you say it is? Because one of the troubles with the local model is it basically just functions as a small gang instead of a large gang, which was Malice's point about this is a small gang. Now you could always leave based on zip codes, and that is possible to do. But moving is hard and so forth. And I think West Virginia has this problem. West Virginia, I've read a lot up on it. Their teachers' unions is quite vicious against the charter school and the cyber school and homeschooling movement. Swithin has said that England has had a particularly liberal, in the classical sense, homeschooling. He doesn't even have to register or anything. So do you think that the pre-whatever you said change model was all good or better, so to speak, the local model? And do you think there are some inadvertent upsides to having an outright draconian system? Since Common Core, even some liberal people I know think, this is these tests are dehumanizing, teaching to the test. This is a sham. So, Mike?
In terms of, I don't necessarily believe in golden ages, so I don't. Like I said, the curriculum was always an issue. How do you teach people? So that's true whether you have a centralized system or whether you have a local system. And I think it's true that you have little gangs versus big gangs, which is why now today I say that there should be no compulsory education law. However, depending on where you were, schools were, even today, there are no truant officers, and I don't recall there being a truant officer in the district where I was both a board member, worked, and grew up. You just didn't. There was no real active, let's go out and get these people that aren't going to school. So I think it depends on where you were. But in rural schools, I doubt whether that was at all the case, because in the local model, you're, on the school board, you have all your neighbors and stuff. And so if you're having to go after some of them for not sending their kid to school, there's going to be problems in the community. So that was not my sense either while I was in a small school working there or a board member. And in today's world, for instance, I was superintendent at 4 different districts. We were responsible for attendance and whether people went to school or not. But there was no incentive for me to go after people who weren't going to school because normally they were going to homeschool. I was the one that was supposed to check that. We're the ones that have the homeschool affidavits on file. We got no extra money for going after people, so we didn't. If people chose to do homeschool, that was up to them. If people didn't attend, it was very rare that we would put pressure on people for not attending school, because generally speaking, those people are more problematic for my job as an administrator. It would mean that they would be more discipline issues. So this idea that it depends on which school you're at. I suppose there are some bigger schools where they have a department that does that, but most small schools and the schools I was involved with, we didn't do that. And I don't recall historically that that happened a lot either. But again, I'm at the point now where I'm saying no mandatory attendance anywhere. So let the market, let people decide what they're going to do. Most people will send their kids to school. Kindergarten is not a mandatory grade level, but most people send their kid to kindergarten. You don't have to do that, even in California today, but most people do, because parents use school as childcare, and that's one of our big problems. Is that even for the very best of parents, that's kind of one of the big draws for it is I can send my kid to school and I can go to work. And that's problematic in terms of developing a curriculum and trying to get people to learn. I hope that did that answer the question?
Yes, it answered the question. I do think there did exist. Again, the problem is the United States is still very much decentralized. So what's true in California is not true in Florida, which is not true in New York, which is not true in Pennsylvania. So there's some variations. But truant officers up until like the 50s did exist. In certain areas, I mean, they're basically the equivalent of social service officers at this point. But Swithin, you can continue on the question. But yes, you did answer my question. Thanks.
So, Mike, you said that there are no sort of golden ages in the schooling system. Many conservative types will say that there's a great decline in the education system and schooling from the post-war period onwards. Is that a position that you would agree with in the Californian experience, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
I think that curriculum-wise, what you teach and how you get people to learn has always been extremely difficult and always been controversial of what you're going to do. It's just that if you're not included, the larger the pool you're included in, the more difficult it becomes. So, for instance, the school where I grew up, and while I was growing up, and while they had a really good music program both at the elementary school and at the high school, and they were blessed with really good music teachers. They had a great ag program. They had a great shop program. Those were initiatives and things that the local people did. But the controversy of how do you teach people and whether you're teaching them the right thing, that hasn't really changed. That's always been a problem. The real critical thing was the funding change that then allowed outside agencies to really just say to schools, like my high school had a music building and a band and everything. It was only until the centralization and the really emphasis towards college came in that any of those programs began to really suffer. So from that regard, the centralization that forced people into saying college is the place that you go, and that focus and the focusing of the money has been the critical problem. But the core kinds of things of how you teach people and what's important, and this teacher versus that teacher. That's always been a problem. Even when I was in school, my Spanish teacher had us translate a book, Spanish 1, translate a book, which is actually a horrible way to learn a language. And yet that teacher was teaching that way then. That really hasn't changed, whether it's centralized or not. Some of the things that people do to teach have been ineffective then, and they're ineffective now. But to me, it's just the centralizing of the power, where a community can't make a decision on their own what they want to do. If a community wants a socialist school, that's fine. I have a socialist school. But if you have it so that people don't have to go to that school, there's no mandatory requirement to go to school there. People could make other choices. And when you're decentralized, that's what I think would make the whole situation better.
Who would you say the current education system is running the interests of? Who's sort of the main string pullers? Is it the unions, teaching unions these days, or is it just sort of like a permanent educational bureaucracy in the state, which is basically running their interests? Who, if you were to pick one or a number of groups, who would you say really is the string pullers, and whose interest ultimately is it running? Whose interest is it ultimately running for?
That's obvious. It's like a symbiotic relationship between the unions and the politicians and the bureaucracy that runs the schools. Again, that all occurred in the mid 70s. So once they centralized the money, and once they formalized the arrangement for collective bargaining, I think the biggest union, or the biggest, whatever you want to call it, because they don't, association, the CTA and the American, I can't remember the name of the other big unit in California. I think they're the biggest employee group in the state, and they reap huge amounts of money that then they filter to the politicians, and that is what supports the structure at the state of the bureaucracy of education. It didn't used to exist before. I think I told you that I've been involved long enough that I used to go to Sacramento years ago. Sacramento used to be a little, 5-story kind of arrangement downtown. Now you've got huge skyscrapers you see, 30 miles away. So it really benefits the people that it benefited me. I mean, I was part of that system. So it benefits the employees, benefits the unions, benefits the bureaucracy at the state, and benefits politicians, because if 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 billion dollars a year is devoted to funding of schools, a big chunk of that goes into teachers, which then goes directly into unions. And so that's really what happens. The governor is proposing $2 billion to reward schools for opening now. That's one of the things. It's not to open schools. It's that money will directly go into the pockets of the union, because people are right now negotiating all kinds of things in regard to COVID about, extra pay, all kinds of things related to, well, if I have to come to work, this is what you need to do. So all he's doing is just passing on a huge block of money that will eventually go directly to the unions.
Oh yes, the COVID policy, as Hans Hoppe pointed out, is wicked, absurd. It's just politicians could get away with basically outright theft. But nonetheless, you said you've benefited from it. I have a number of family members who've worked in the school system, and in general, this to me is the sort of anti-conspiracy view, which is at times the view I actually hold when people say that school systems are run by Marxists. When sometimes conservatives say that. I'm going to point out just sort of pocketbook interest. being a school teacher is a good job. A lot of school teachers complain about it, but if you work for the private sector, you're not going to get a 50-year pension. You can't work for 25 and retire for 50. That was true for many of my extended family. They work for the school system for 25 or 30 years, and you only work 180 days a year. There's no private sector job that gets that. And the people complain about the CEOs getting the big payoffs. You can take a Kevin Carson understanding of economics, and I vaguely might agree with that. But in general, there's no large sector of people that do as well as, considering the skill level of the job. And if you go abroad and teach children, you're not going to get the same payment. You're not going to get the same payment. You're going to have to work more hours, and you're going to have more students you have to deal with. So being a school teacher is a good job in the pocketbook sense, and it clearly benefits all of the people there. To what extent does that motivate people to become public school teachers? This is the fact that it's a nice job that pays a nice salary and pays a nice pension. Mike?
Well, there are lots of people that become teachers because they love to be with kids and they love to do that kind of work. So it is a good job. It is a very good job. I was in many different communities, and the average pay for teachers is well above the average pay for anyone that would be in any particular community you were in. And like I said, I was all over the state, so I'm very confident of that. Sometimes people misconstrue the roles of teacher with administrator. So I got a little bias here in that administrators generally, my contract was generally 230 days a year, between 225 and 230 days. So it was quite a bit longer than the regular teacher. And in many regards, I was one of the lower paid people at a school district. But I think a lot of people do go into teaching because they get, summer months off. And especially now, because now there's a real problem in that parents are really taking a huge role on with their kids because of COVID, and teachers are doing mostly Zoom, and their amount of time they're spending to do that has been greatly reduced, and yet their salaries and benefits continue. So it's a real problem in regard to long-term for schools, because I think people are going to begin to realize that. But most people go into teaching because they want to do that with kids, and they like that environment. And I think most of them would do it even if conditions changed. Again, it's like everything else. There's a small group of people who work the system. The unions work the system. And most of the rest of the people really go about their business and really don't want to take part in that. But again, they benefit from the fact that there is a group that actively works the system. So most teachers really are in it because they like to teach, they like kids, and would do it for, just like most baseball players. Most baseball players would probably want to play baseball regardless of the economic rents that are created by the system that some people have developed. So again, if you had no requirement to send kids to school, you would then have a less of a monopoly, and you would start to see changes in how people do things. Most private schools pay their teachers much less than public school teachers. Yet lots of people send their kid to private school, and lots of people work in private schools because they don't want to deal with the issues in public school. So again, I think most people would still be teachers even if situation changed. But there are those that move to that system because it gives them certain benefits and have created a system that makes certain benefits. So
I agree that most people would still be teachers because they don't have any other alternative if they just half their salaries. But I'm genuinely curious if a lot of the people would continue and a lot of new people would move in if they half their salary, so to speak. There are pros and cons to the sort of careerist mentality. One of the funny things about the careerist mentality is in some ways I think the school district has sort of like a late Soviet Union type feel to it, in the sense that you just have a bunch of you don't have zealots in it. You don't have people in it to now again you can dispute what exactly is the role of the teacher. I'm some of a Randian or a Calvinist in the sense I think, although I'm an agnostic, is I don't think there's neutral teaching, but that's sort of an aside. That's sort of an aside that we don't necessarily need to go into. But yeah, people do join private schools to be more zealot. I'm using that word in the affirmational sense, but I'm suspicious of the degree of which it is. But so then you want to keep continuing on your questions, and thanks.
Mike, do you think what type of student do you think does relatively well out of the current education public school system? We've made a number of criticisms of it so far, but do you think there's a particular type of student who does relatively well out of the system? What do they look like?
Well, what do you mean by relatively? What do you mean by relatively well?
That's a good question. I mean, they get something of that they think is of value out of it, and who are those people who get it? I mean, that's quite vague. So what I would say, for example, just compare it with the Californian one. So say in England, I would say that the English system benefits those highly agreeable conformist types who are relatively intelligent but not too intelligent, whose sole goal is to maximize their marks in examinations so that they can go to a university to get the maximum amount of marks they can at the university so that they can get the highest paying job they can get. I think those types of people tend to do relatively well out of the system because they can be relatively conscientious. They will stand out from the rest of their peers, and they can ascend the system relatively easily, and then they can get what they want at the end, their nice big rubber stamp degree, which then opens doors to the finance world or other places like that. So that's broadly who I'd say does well. So as an aside, actually, I think in the current system, girls do out much better than boys do, basically because of their they tend to be significantly more conformist and agreeable than the boys typically are. So that's who I'd say, broadly speaking, I think do well out of the English system. Would you say that's similar in the Californian public school system, or is it somewhat different?
No, I would say that that's probably exactly the same. And there's research that shows that. But essentially, you have to ask the question. Fundamentally, is I did well in school, so I was able to go through school. My career got me to being a superintendent of schools, which I guess is successful, a good salary, all that, raised a family. So I guess that I was one of those successful people. However, there's lots that in the last 10 years I've learned that could have been learned a long time ago. So although I was one of those successful students that the system helped, in quotations, there's a whole different, that's the reason why I asked the question. There's a whole different set of things that really are criteria for what really was successful. I wish I would have known some of the things in terms of history I wasn't taught, economics I wasn't taught way back then, because I think I would have been even more successful. Although it might have meant that I would not have pursued a career in education because of the problems that education kind of creates. And I retired because I no longer wanted to be a part of that system. I thought for the longest time that, well, I could make a difference. I could change something. I could make something better. But I came to realize that regardless of what I did, the inertia of the system and the way it was structured made that impossible. And so I could no longer, directly do that. And so in many regards, there are regrets that I have, but I don't know that I could have done anything different based on, the history of what I went through as an individual. So I think the students that are successful are the same, but them getting their diploma and then going on to college, what are they going to do in college? I for the longest time would tell people, why are you going to college? And the answer was vague. I had a student a couple years ago that got accepted to Harvard and Yale, and when I asked him why he was going, he had no answer. So yeah, he was successful in being able to get into those great universities, but the purpose of why he did was oblivious to him.
Oh yeah, we live in a sort of a telos society, a purposeless society, and I would say education has no purpose. The default purpose of education, and I find this hilarious considering the claimed politics of some of the radicals in the school system. The claimed purpose of school is basically to make make students money. That's the funk, or make them rise in the bureaucracy, which is basically the same thing. So yeah, I would say that's the actual purpose of the school system. And I think you could get one time in college, we have the same degree. One time in college, in an anthropology class, someone asked me to get the professor, who was probably a leftist of some regard, asked me to give a Marxist critique of education, and I wrote this on the test as a response. I didn't really care about my grade at this point. I think I might have gotten a C or a D in that class. I didn't really care. But I described the college system. I said that college is a system that the school system is a system that creates more system apparatus members. People go to school to get to college. Why do they go to college? To become college professors or public school teachers, to create more college professors or school teachers. Now, this leaves out all the people who don't do well in school. Now you get the sort of, I think Yaron Brooks once pointed out that one of the upsides of the American system is you get the sort of dropout mentality. Smart guys invest in bitcoins, midwits go to college. You get the sort of dropout mentality, which has sort of started up again in the United States, which the United States has huge influence of that. But yeah, I would say the school system in that regard has no purpose other than creating more. In certain ways, to me, the system just exists to benefit the members running it, which is why I think it eventually will fall apart once enough people get no benefit out of it. So going forward, do you think the school system? Well, first of all, do you agree with that general interpretation of the school system as just basically existing to help the certain people that Swithin just described? And going forward, do you think this monopoly? Well, it's not. To me, it's just going to come if. Hopefully, it's going to fall. When it's going to fall, not if. But maybe it'll just keep going on indefinitely. I think there has to be some pressure valves that exist in it. Mike?
Well, one of the silver linings behind the COVID thing is that as they've shut down schools, it's kind of demonstrated to people that maybe they aren't what they're cracked up to be. I think that there's going to be because once the whole thing gets settled, I think there's going to be a dramatic drop in the number of people who are going to public school. I think initially it could be 5%, 10%, depending on whether they make vaccines mandatory. I think a lot of people are having second thoughts about that. For the longest time, vaccinations were not mandatory because parents were able to put in a request that was operated by each individual school that they requested not having vaccines. And it's only been in the last 10 years where the state has been demanding more mandatory stuff. At the time they started doing that, I said, this is a bad idea. There shouldn't be any mandatory vaccines. This should be between doctors and their families making that decision. But again, that's just another little tiny ripple of what the centralization does. But I think there's going to be a dramatic drop over time in the number of people that choose the public school model. I think there's going to be other things that are going to occur. And if they were to eliminate the mandatory attendance rules, which I'm telling people now, that's the only reform that you really need. Because once you tell people, and there will be no sanctions at all, there are few sanctions now, but that would open the door to no sanctions at all, because people that are law-abiding, you put a little tiny barrier in them, they will do the law-abiding thing. And once you eliminate that, you're going to see a huge difference. Will they do it? I don't know. But I think that there's going to be a change in attitude, because people are seeing, I don't pay attention to a lot of stuff in the system anymore because I'm out of it, but I have a friend that's still in it. He said that his school board was inundated with letters from teachers about why the school shouldn't open and how horrible it would be. You're putting my life in danger, yada, yada, yada. One teacher who does a couple hours of work on Zoom a day, actually now living on the East Coast, teaching in California school, said, why should I have to come back to go to work? So people are going to figure that out. And I think that's going to have a really detrimental effect and open a lot of people's eyes as to what has been going on. To me, the free market, and this has been how I felt all along, that there was no way for me as administrator to make changes if the bulk of the system simply was going to go on regardless of what I did. I couldn't go to teachers and say, you know what, we really need to rethink this, because they really didn't have to. So to the extent that people eyes are opened, and if they eliminate the monopoly aspect of it, there will be major changes that occur, which I'm recommending. As a long-time school person, the monopoly and the rules and the intervention by the central government has not been helpful to my profession or to the quality of what we have done for students. And I think there's going to be some big changes. When and how that happens, I don't know. But again, I don't believe you can plan complex systems anyway. So I don't know if I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think that's a very clear answer. I would agree there seems to be a lot of, there could well be some changes afoot. Although my concern is that you might get more people pulling out of the public schools, etc., but this will just be a justification for further regulation of alternatives. That's what I suspect is going to happen in England. They've tried to regulate the home education sector and other sectors more closely, and I suspect that they will continue to do so. Also, with your suggestion of abolishing compulsory attendance laws, I would agree entirely. Although I think you also need to look at things like the child labour laws as well, because if you have them taken out And then we mentioned before, a lot of parents use these schools as daycare. And let's suppose that they don't think they can afford, for whatever, better, for rightly or wrongly, to keep them. Then they're going to have to want to have them somewhere where they may be useful, or be having something of use happening with them. So I think some basically abolition there would probably be of significant help. So Mike, any final comments?
Well, that last comment, again, I would agree. But see, what happens in this modern world is they've created a Gordian knot so that you can't just undo part of it and think that things are going to change. And that's purposeful. I mean, the reason why the Gordian knot was made was so that the horse or the cart or whatever couldn't be taken, because you couldn't figure out how to do the whole thing. So that's been their purpose. Make it so complex that one single change won't do anything, and then they can say, see, it didn't work. So compulsory attendance laws, the labor laws, all it's a whole system. It overlaps box to box to box. And that's going to be one of the challenges to fix it, because people want, well, let's just change that thing. And they think, well, that'll fix everything. It won't. There's all kinds of things that the politicians and lawyers have done to create the system and make it so complex that you can't really do just one thing. You have to think very clearly about what's the problem, and you can't just fix one thing. That's why the free market works so well. It allows lots of ideas to be tried and tested and evolved, and it makes the system work far better. So they did that purposely. The Gordian knot by politicians has been purposeful.
The Gordian knot, that's an interesting analogy, and I would largely agree with it. But I do think there is some problems with so I agree with the free market, and I'm glad you said earlier on that you're okay with a socialist, someone running a socialist school, which goes back to Swithin's point, how the Thatcherites, in an attempt they were afraid of the local councils, so they created some centralized control system, and this is a sort of Trojan horse. Do people want change, so to speak? Lots of people enjoy public schools. Now, again, I gave my sort of Marxist, Hoppian, libertarian criticism of the school system earlier on, but lots of people enjoy school in a way, and I don't think it's inauthentic enjoyment. I think they do generally enjoy the system, so to speak. Now, again, the system itself is propped up in a way, but the proper uppers seem to enjoy propping it up. A lot of them do. A whole lot of people in the United States, the whole goal is to basically make enough money to send their kids to college. Or move to a better zip code to go to a better school. So do people want the you brought up the example of the Gordian knot. Do people want the change, so to speak? Most people still have an aversion to homeschooling, which I think is somewhat genuine, and I think it's somewhat rational. I was public school as well. Thaddeus Russell, he's sort of a center anarchist in some ways. He hates schools, but he sends his kids to public schools, A, because he doesn't want to homeschool, and B, because he doesn't want to be the bad guy teacher. He stated that basically on his podcast. He just said he just outsources to school. And that Russell is very good criticism of it. He's been on the School Sucks podcast numerous times. So do you think people want the change? You say about the free market, and I agree. But do you think people want an alternative, Mike?
I think it's obvious a lot of people do, but there are some people that don't. That's the beauty of the free market. Those people that want to choose. I would envision a system where the public school would continue, and there would be people that would choose that. But there would be no onus for people that choose something different. My daughter sends her kids to a charter school and the charter school is not favored by the local school district. In fact, they often try and do things to hinder it. My worst experiences in going in and subbing in schools have been in actual charter schools. They were horrible. So the freedom and independence of creating a school outside of the normal structure doesn't necessarily mean you're going to create any structure that's better. But the fact that the people create it and they want to go to it is really none of my business. If people want to continue to go to a public school with all of the accoutrements and the system and the issues, I think that's perfectly okay. But I think that people should have the choice to do that, and they should have the choice to have other options. If they choose not to send their child to school at all and want to just teach them things at home, I think that's perfectly okay too. In the model we have now, that's discouraged in a great way with some sanctions possible. And I believe the sanctions will get more difficult if the system stays centralized. That's why I think, if someone wants to stay with public school, great. And I think that will serve the purpose of certain people, and that would be fine. But if you really, want to do the right thing for the most people, you need to change that attendance law and allow people to make free choices.
Thank you, Mike, for joining us. It's been an interesting and enlightening discussion. I'd now just like to thank everybody for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and we may end up being big enough to be banned by Twitter and Facebook. If you'd like to contact the show, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.